So let's talk about mixing. The band's on stage, making noise, you're at the console. What's your approach?
Well, the approach to mixing is, again, you got to think about what kind of content you're getting. Are they an acoustic set? Is it a male vocalist? Is it a female vocalist? Whatever you got to think about. Is it going to be an aggressive sound? Is it going to be a smooth sound? Is it going to be these things? Take all that into context. And I try to place, I think for every sound guy, they have these sounds inside their head of what things are supposed to sound like when they push up a fader. And, when you push up a kick drum and you hear something and it's not what you imagine it should be, and you start sculpting that sound, what you imagine is a pretty important thing. And then once you're done and you feel like, okay, that's close to what I imagined, and then you move on to the snare or whatever and the rest of the kit, and then you move on for all those things. I think what you imagine is a pretty important thing. If you're and knowing the context for what you're mixing for is a big deal. Is it an audience full of college kids who are going to love it? Is it an audience full of older people who are going to be like real offended by it? And is it going to be an exciting time? I mean, you don't mix a band for a funeral, like you would mix, and I have had to mix a band for a funeral. I mean, I've been in that scenario. So you don't mix a band for the funeral the same way you would mix, a huge college Bible study. And it's just not the same audience. So you've got to think about what is in your head before you start dialing. And part of that is, what are your influences? What works? What CD have you put in the player recently and you go, man, if I could get the kick drums to sound like that? Or what concert did you go to and love the way that felt? What was in your head that influences your imagination when you're dialing in those knobs? And I think those are all pretty key parts to building your mix. I've always joked around before too. When you build a mix, I think one of the foundational parts of a mix that's really important is the low end, and the low end is such a critical part. The subwoofers, and making sure that they're timed in correctly with the system and that they're arrayed right, and that everybody's getting good coverage, and not just front of house is going to have certain pockets of low end that's working and some that's not, and those are all important things. But when you step behind the console and you're dialing in, particularly the kick and bass. I've always joked around with my guys and my volunteers. I said, once you get the booty right, everything else kind of falls into place. And I feel like that's so true. You get the low end right, you get the kick sounding right, and you get the bass to where you can hear the tones and you can feel the parts that need to be felt, and that certain notes of the bass guitar aren't sticking out over others, and that it's a very smooth sound. I think these are very foundational parts of a mix. So I usually start with kick and bass. I typically put them in the same VCA for that reason. I'll solo a VCA and work on them, and kind of go from there. Drum kit, I'll dial that in, and like I said, it's all about what's in your head before you start dialing in, before you've even heard that snare and you push up that snare mic, and what you expect to hear and what you're wanting to hear is what's going to drive you to change things until you get there. And sometimes you just never get there. Sometimes you're just like, that's what I got to deal with, and you got to move on because reality is time and what have you. Or maybe the instrument isn't your favorite kind of snare or whatever. And I find myself a lot of times just kind of getting as close as I can get to what my imagination could be, and then moving on, and then trying to tie that all in together and making it mix. I think one of the key things to mixing too is a lot of guys try to make each individual instrument sound good. And I think that's an important part, but that's not mixing. And mixing is making each instrument sound good with the others. And if you pushed up my acoustic guitar sometimes and just soloed it, you would just think that sounds horrible. But in reality, when you put it with the rest of the mix, it's one of those things that's like, yeah, that works. I hear what it's doing. It's filling the spectrum that I need it to fill. It's not getting covered up by the hi-hat or other things in its spectrum. And, it works. and the same thing with a lot of other instruments. I don't tear them apart where they would be. If you solo them, they would sound horrible, but they're probably not by itself. If it was just an acoustic guitar up here, yeah, I'd let the low end go on it, and I'd let the body of the guitar really carry that mix. But you just can't do that when you've got a bass guitar and 2 electrics and these huge drums on stage to have all of those things in the mix at once. So building a mix is about making each instrument not just sound good by itself, but sound good with other things. And that's, to me, is one of the other things that you have to think about. How does this guitar sound with this piano? And how does the toms mix with these things, And those are some key elements to making sure that when you come together, you've got a mix built there that works.